It's said that FHIR is the answer to all the problems in healthcare data interoperability. But is it? I would argue that 70% of the data that you own is locked in legacy systems. So how does FHIR help you access this data that's locked inside systems that are not compliant with FHIR, those old systems that we have laid around our network infrastructure? So join me on the Healthcare Data Matters podcast today, where we will discuss how to FHIR enable legacy data. Well, congratulations and thanks very much if you made it this far. Today, as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at how we deal with what I consider to be the majority of the data that most healthcare institutions own, and that's legacy data. That's data that's not being currently accessed, maybe residing in a system that's effectively read-only. And how do we bring that into a modern world to create the 360-degree patient view? How do we FHIR enable that legacy data so that it's available to any clinician in any place at any time, and also doesn't have to go into those legacy historic systems to gain access to it? So we've got ease of access. FHIR solves that problem, but it really doesn't solve it for those legacy systems. I'm going to be joined today by a colleague of mine, Mr. Tim Kaschinkse, and we're going to talk over what we see with our customers, the problems that they face, the challenges that they tackle, and we're going to be looking at how we at BridgeHead Software can help you in solving these problems in FHIR enabling that legacy data.
So thank you for joining us, Tim, today. The first question we're going to talk to you about this is BridgeHead have a long history in storing clinical data, managing healthcare data in all its forms, and we've changed quite significantly the way we're storing data in our HealthStore platform over recent years. And I wonder if it's possible if you can just talk to me a little bit about what we've done there, and we'll talk about that through the rest of the session today.
Sure. Our evolution has been around starting out with imaging and going to documents and supporting standards like DICOM and XDS. And we've run into some issues storing things as documents because, once you've set the document, that's how the data is viewed forever on at that point, if it's a PDF or something like that. Whereas if you store the discrete data, if you store the data within the document, you can then render it different ways later. So we were looking for a way to store the actual data that's in the document. And so instead of building the document, we looked for a way to, how can we actually store the data that's used to build the document? And we settled on looked at FHIR. FHIR describes about 150 resources in healthcare, and that allowed us to store pretty much any type of data that we were going to come across. So we've started storing our data in a FHIR format using the FHIR resources as the template for what gets stored into our database. And that allows us to store things. The FHIR resources, there are FHIR resources for imaging, so we can still support our DICOM imaging. It supports documents, we can still support documents, and it supports discrete data. So it allows us a very flexible way to store data in our system so that we can get access to the data and display it in the way that it's needed.
And that's good. And when we're talking about application retirement, we've got multiple types of data, right? So I assume that then applies, I think as you said, we can have a single repository of different types of clinical data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, because the types of data you get from an application that's being retired might vary. We see applications where everything comes in a document. We see applications where everything is discrete data, and the users of that application are used to accessing the discrete data, being able to do trending, things like that. And so needing to have access to the data as a discrete format is really important. So by storing it in the FHIR resources, it allows us to store it in the format that we received it. So that's one thing. The next thing that it does is that it separates how we display the data from how we store. So if we were building a PDF, at the time that we were storing the data as a PDF, we had to consider how it was being rendered. Whereas now that we're storing it as a FHIR resource, we don't have to be so concerned about rendering the data at that point. We can render the data later when it's time to display it.
And I suppose that's a really important point as well, isn't it? Because does that then mean we can some customers, I'm sure, say to us that there are some data types that I simply want to store, and there's others that I'm going to use daily. So we've now got a good cost model in terms of the effort during the migration process. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, it is true, and there's a couple reasons why they might just want to store it. Take the orders for example. They may want to store that because that tells them information about the data. So, for example, the order would often have the accession number that links the images to the report. And so by storing the order, that gives you the information you need to link those two if you need to display both. So there are definitely reasons to store data and not necessarily have it available for viewing. But then there is data like laboratory data. They may want to take a look at that, and they may want to look at it over time. So they may want to pull up blood work from a couple of months ago, and they just switched to a new EMR, but that blood work is in the legacy data. By storing it as a FHIR resource, we can make that data available through a FHIR API, so they can extract both the blood work that we have and the blood work that they have in the new application and do trending across those.
So it sounds very powerful. So I think maybe we've covered this question, but let's just make sure we reiterate it, and that's the benefits to the customer. So we already in the introduction to this, we already explained about our activities around legacy retirement, but certainly with the discrete data, the way we're using FHIR resources, how do you think the customer's really benefiting from this?
Well, there's a couple ways that they benefit. Number one, as a legacy application, they probably aren't using it, probably aren't updating it regularly, which means they're not necessarily getting all the security updates. And from a security perspective, that makes them vulnerable. So one of the things, by getting the data out of that application and storing it in a new format, you get rid of that vulnerability, and by getting rid of that application. So that's one thing that benefits customers. The other thing is then by putting it in a newer format, such as a FHIR resource, you now make it available using other standards. So the older application may or may not support FHIR. Typically they don't. But even if they do, it's likely in a newer version that they haven't upgraded to, or it's a purchasable option that they haven't purchased. So they don't have the ability to share that data via FHIR. So by extracting it from that application and storing it in a FHIR repository, that allows us to make that data now available using the new FHIR standard.
Well, that's fantastic, and therefore you've just done my job for me, because I think there's the title of this presentation, isn't it? FHIR enabling legacy data, and that's definitely what we're going to call this. That's one job I've done there. Well, that's fantastic. I've got one last question. FHIR is brilliant. FHIR is dominating. Everyone's talking about FHIR, but you and I have been around long enough to know that there's far more HL7 out there than FHIR, and indeed other standards out there. So is this only FHIR? I'm dominated by HL7 in my organization. How can you help me?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what's happening out there is that HL7 is working. It's if it isn't broken, don't fix it, right? So people are going to continue to use HL7. They'll continue to use it to exchange patient information. Labs already distribute their results via HL7. Many applications deliver their results via HL7. So it's not going away anytime soon. But there are things you can do now with FHIR that you couldn't do before. And so how do you merge those two worlds? So one of the things we're doing with our FHIR repository is we're receiving data via HL7. So we get the lab results via HL7. We can ingest those, and we take those and store those as a FHIR resource also. So using the same technology that we do for application retirement, only in this case, it's coming from HL7. And that allows us to store that data then as a FHIR resource and make that data available as FHIR as well, and make it connected with all the other data. So now if we've got the lab data from application that we've retired, and we're also getting the HL7 feed from the new lab system in our FHIR repository. Now we have both sets of lab data, and we can make that available through FHIR for trending purposes, things like that, or analytics. Most of the analytics engines out there support FHIR, and they don't necessarily support the HL7 traditional HL7 interface. So by querying our FHIR repository, they can then have access. The analytics tools like Power BI can then have access to all the data that we've ingested, both from the legacy application and from the real-time application.
And that's, I mean, again, a great explanation. Thank you. And we haven't really covered real-time data, and maybe that's a talk for another topic here, because we have focused mainly on legacy data. But I think it's a really important point that most of the work that we're doing around PACS and DICOM, there's a very big element of real-time data in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tim,
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time today. I know you're a very busy man, and I'm sure we will speak again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
Well, I'd like to thank Tim Kaschinkse for joining us today. Hopefully you all found that brief, informative, easily digestible content for what is a very, very big topic on how you get access to that legacy data, create a 360-degree view of your patients, but also use modern interoperability techniques such as FHIR. And of course, not mentioning good old HL7, which got a mention there just at the end. If you've got any questions or comments, remember these are our views. You may have different ones, and we'd be delighted to hear them and discuss those with you. And if you do have, please contact us at marketing@bridgeheadsoftware.com. Or if you are watching this through YouTube or any other social media, please leave a comment below. The comments are most important to us because they help us understand that we're speaking your language and we're understanding what you're talking about. And also like and subscribe and all those usual social media things. So thanks very much for joining us today, and please look out for any other healthcare data matters vlogs that we've got coming out. We've got them on many, many topics. So thank you. I hope you found this useful.